You've entered Bookstorm. Your favorite authors are here to dive down deep into their best-selling books. Stay tuned to brave the storm.
Welcome back to Bookstorm Podcast listeners. I'm your co-host, Kristen Civiletto, and we've got you all over the world in 102 countries and territories in all 50 states. And we know why. It is because we are bringing you the very best authors out there today. And today is no exception. We're welcoming back to the show New York Times bestselling author, CHRIS Pavone. Welcome, Chris.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
We're
Great to see you
excited.
again.
It is. And you know what? You were on the show to talk about Two Nights in Lisbon. That was an instant bestseller. We loved the book and we had such a fantastic interview. We went really deep in that interview. And this book is going to be no different. We're here to talk about The Doorman. And I know you want to tell us a little bit about the story and maybe what inspired it. But first, I'd like to tell our listeners a little more about your background. They love to hear, maybe what you did in your past life. Now, in this situation, of course, many people already know you from Two Nights in Lisbon, but you have other books that are just tremendously popular. Um, the Paris Diversion, The Travelers, The Accident. Many people know you from The Expats, a book that you wrote when your wife was transferred overseas. And I think you were living some of that experience, perhaps not all the thrilling parts, but
Yeah,
but a lot of people know you from your writing. But in addition to that, you served as an editor for nearly 2 decades. And of course, you've gotten so many accolades. You've won both the Edgar and Anthony Awards, and you've also been nominated for a number of awards for your writing. We know you live in New York City, and we're going to see that loud and clear in this story. But we are just thrilled that you're here.
thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Now, would you mind just telling us just a little bit of the background of what's going on in the story and maybe even what inspired it? Because this is a very intriguing title, The Doorman.
The Doorman is a thriller about race and class and privilege. It's a modern day Bonfire of the Vanities that revolves around a doorman at a fancy New York apartment house who gets caught up in a web of adultery, robbery, and murder. The book was inspired by a real doorman in my life named Johnny Irizzari. Johnny worked at our apartment house for 37 years. It's the only job he ever had, greeting the people who live in the building and plenty who don't, the tourists, the neighborhood people, their kids, their dogs, the tourists who never stop taking pictures out front. And Johnny had a warmth you could feel from across the street. And people who moved away from this building would come back just to visit him. And then he got sick. He spent a few months in the hospital, and as soon as he was able, all he wanted to do was come back to work. For the next 2 years, he stood out there holding the front door and hailing cabs and carrying bags while also definitely dying. Before his illness, Johnny and I used to stand out on the street talking about baseball and his softball team and anti-inflammatories to use for our middle-aged man knees. Then after he came back from his illness, we were standing out there talking about God and the meaning of life and what the point of it all is. And at the end of one shift, somebody asked Johnny how he was feeling, and he said, "I'm so tired, man." And he went home and he died. He lived his whole life in Harlem, a few miles from this building, but he planned for his memorial service to be held just a couple of blocks from this building so that the people he worked for could most easily attend. And he was buried in his full doorman uniform, complete with the cap. And the only non regulation item was a New York Mets pin on his tie. And that pin broke my heart. In fact, the whole thing, all of it, Johnny broke my heart. And that type of dedication to a job and a singular life, doing the one thing and making a real impact on people, is what inspired me to write a book about a doorman.
Wow. And first of all, I'm very sorry for the loss of your friend because
Thank
that's
you.
what he became. And I have to say that gives a whole different dimension to this story because we're almost looking at humanity through the eyes of this character. And what an impression of humanity you have after all of those decades of observing people, interacting with people, Fascinating, fascinating. And I can understand how that inspired so much of what happened in this story. Wow.
Well, in truth, Johnny's persona inspired the character of Chicky in the story, but not Johnny's life. That is not in these pages. The action here is not based on that real person. And just as the building is not based on this real building, none of the characters are based on people in the real world, but they're all an exaggeration and a bunch of types that I wanted to create in order to illustrate a bunch of things that are going on in our society right now, and then also to generate some tension. These are three main characters: are Chicky, the doorman, and a resident named Emily, who is married to a billionaire, and a middle-aged guy named Julian, who is trying to figure out what his purpose is in life. And these three people all have very, very complicated relationships to each other. They are all in one way or another in love with each other, and they're what drives the plot of this story is what is going to happen to these three people. And I think it's very clear from the opening sentence that somebody is going to get killed in this story. And the reader's journey is really to discover who and when and how, and I think most interestingly, why.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an absolutely blistering book in terms of you examine things that we've been thinking for a while and that maybe people don't have maybe the courage to say. And every page has that tension. It is a phenomenal book. It's a different book. And, we'll get into some of these details, but I want to go back to something you had just said a second ago about this being an examination of class and race. Sometimes you were zeroing in on people at both ends of the socioeconomic spectrum, but you did it against the backdrop of New York City. And I
Yeah.
wanted to ask you if New York City was kind of a stand in for life in some respects, because it's a tough place. And no matter your wealth or your status, you're impacted by violence, by racism, by the judgment of others, by health concerns, by wanting to feel loved. And we see all of that against that backdrop. Do you think is that what you were trying to do, is show our common humanity, but with New York City as that protagonist?
Yeah, I think one of the things that makes New York and a New York novel such a useful form is that here in America's most populous, most densely packed place, we confront all the issues every
Yeah.
day. We confront race and racism and class and income inequality and greed and crime and religious strife and ethnic strife and political strife. This is a very non-homogeneous place, and we are all elbow to elbow on top of each other with our different everythings and needing to deal with that. This is the capital of finance and culture, where art and money are always butting up against each other. And we are all of us, always butting up against each other. All of which is to say, I think that New York is a very useful setting to address what it means to live in America right now and to be interconnected. We don't have gated communities here. And although there are some places like the fictional Bohemia in this book and my very real life apartment in that I'm sitting in right now, that maybe try to approximate the experience of being a gated community and being a homogenous place and not having a great diversity of residents, it fails. It's such a minuscule sliver of the city. There are plenty of class and ethnic and racial stratification in our neighborhoods, but even so, we are all together all the time. I think in ways that people who don't live in cities don't have necessarily as a daily experience. And I think this view into what it means to all be on top of each other and all to be forced to interact with each other and to know each other, I think that's what the opportunity is in a New York novel.
Yeah. Yeah, you felt that tension. You felt it in the traffic and the hustling and the bustling and the people who have to come together to make an apartment complex work.
Yeah,
And in fact, there were so many passages that I marked in your story that I was just like, wow, that just hit me, including one where the superintendent, 99% of the time is interacting with men,
yeah,
and all of the women at this, fictional place who were working were all foreign women. And
yeah.
and just to just put that in perspective, it was very stark and, you know, very, very profound, I have to say.
Mhm.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about Julian. He
Yeah.
was really wrestling with these ideas of class and culture distinctions. And sometimes he didn't know exactly how he fit into some of these different distinctions. And he certainly didn't feel like he fit into his family in some ways. Everybody was busy doing their thing, his kids, his wife. And he started to choose and make some choices for things that temporarily made him feel good or better about himself. But I wanted to ask you, do you think that these identities are starting to sow some confusion in people? Because we all have multiple identities. Maybe it's gender, maybe it's also class, maybe it is, a political affiliation, and they're
Yeah.
not distinct. Is this getting tricky?
It is getting tricky, and it's pretty clear to me. I think it's pretty clear to everyone that this moment in America is one of possibly unprecedented hate. It's not a question of rational political agreement right now. It seems to be a question of visceral hatred. The left hates the right, and the right hates the left. There's anti-Black hate, anti-white hate, anti-immigrant hate, anti-nativist hate, anti-trans hate, anti-religious hate, anti-Trump hate, and a tremendous amount of hate coming from Trump himself. I think I know who's primarily responsible for this horrible state of affairs, but I also admit that I have my own biases and I may not be seeing the world completely free of my own preconceptions, and no one does. And this is something I've tried to address in this novel. These characters all occupy different points on the political spectrum. They are all trying, with good faith, as I believe are most people, to move through the world in ways that they think are best for society, for humanity. But who gets to make that judgment of who's best? And I think a particularly destructive thing that's going on right now, especially on the left, is that people who agree on 99% of the issues find themselves at war with each other over the remaining 1%. And that has opened the door for for a dictator to waltz right in. And I don't think it's completely could be laid at the feet of the dictator himself. I think everybody is responsible for the state of affairs. I think the fighting that we are doing and the arguments that we're having, many of them in good faith, are also pigeonholing ourselves into things that are easily hateable and easy to come at from a point of view of hate.
Yeah. Do you
So,
think?
I mean, that's a very negative take on humanity and the world, and it's something that I think is definitely a part of this novel, and it's in the background there that there is intense strife going on right now, even among people who seem to agree on many things. But primarily, the book is actually really about people who love each other, and it is just not clear for a while who loves whom and what form that love takes and what's going to happen to it.
Yeah. Do you think it's because we've politicized issues that are not political?
Absolutely. I think we've allowed other people to
Mm.
politicize issues that are not political in order to get themselves gain. And I think people on the left especially have allowed the right to define what our issues are in a way that hasn't benefited either not just the left, but I think our society at large. I think we have been set upon each other in a very cynical way.
Mm. Well, I want to press into that a little further because I feel like this is something that Julian was wrestling with. He was thinking about this idea that perhaps our beliefs, something that we have a choice in, like our religion, philosophy, and love. And I could see him wrestling with this. But at times we make those choices at vulnerable points when we're young, when we're in crisis. And so I wanted to ask you, can we trust some of the choices we make when it comes to philosophy, love, religion, because of those points at which we make those decisions?
That's a really good question, and honestly, I can't answer it. But I part of what I want to do in this book is pose this question, and really, I want to pose it to you. I want to pose it to me. I mean, first of all, what is life if not a series of choices? And there are things that we take for granted about ourselves that we think are not choices. And obviously, there are a bunch of things that are not choices. You don't choose the color of your skin. You don't choose the shape of your body. There are things you don't choose where or when you're born or who your parents are. But then we also further assume that there are other things that are not our choices. Is religion a choice? Is what you believe politically a choice? Is who you love a choice? I think we go through life thinking that these things are not, that these things are out of our control. And maybe they are, but maybe they're not. And maybe we can make other choices than the ones that were simply handed to us by the luck of birth or genetics. Um, it has been said many times before, but I will say it again. Writing fiction is an act of empathy. It's an act of inventing characters and trying to put yourself in their shoes, confronting their problems, and asking yourself, what choices would I make? What would I do? And that's what I tried to do as a writer in this book. And that's what I hope that readers can do too, is put yourself into the position of these characters, especially the three main characters, and ask yourself, what would I do?
Yeah, and you did that quite well because a lot of the characters were at a crossroads in their lives. You know, they were at a point where adult children were making their own way, or smaller children were starting school, or other people were encountering, career setbacks or changes. And I was thinking as I was reading this that those are transition points that a lot of people, I think, have trouble navigating. And again, you know, are we vulnerable to making the wrong choices, maybe to an affair when we are at those crossroads?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are, and I think it's my job as a novelist to heighten the drama of those choices. I think one of the biggest choices that a novelist makes from this end of providing the experience is how closely we want our books to mirror real life. And at one end of the spectrum, the very, very realist end of the spectrum, almost nothing happens because that's real life. It's completely credible and possibly beautiful and wonderful, but also probably not very exciting. And at the other end of the spectrum is James Bond, where plenty happens. Almost none of it is credible, but it works as entertainment because everything, the characters, the plot, the action, operate on this consistent level of incredulity. You jump off a cliff to chase a plummeting airplane and get into the cockpit and save it just before it hits the ground. I mean, that's all ridiculous, but it doesn't bother you when you're in that moment because the whole story is ridiculous. That's where that story lives. This book does not occupy that ridiculous end of the spectrum. I want it to be completely credible, but that doesn't mean the same thing as completely realistic. And part of it is that I wanted all of these characters to face very, very important crises at the same moment, in the same place, and they are all interrelated. And that's not really how the real world works, but that's how suspense fiction works, because that's the whole point of the endeavor, is to make the story larger than life, bigger conflicts, higher stakes, more action. So yes, there's an affair. There's more than one immense betrayal. There's robbery and there's murder. And all of these are driven by, as you point out, this moment of transition that all three of these characters happen to be in at the same moment.
Yeah. Well, your book is the opposite of James Bond in another way, whereas that's escapism. This is introspection. This is, you're going to see yourself at some point in the story and be flayed open. That's what you do in the story, but in a way that is compelling and you can't turn it down. In fact, I love that Karen Slaughter said this about your story. Smart, twisty, and sharply written, The Doorman is hard to put down and harder to forget. A delight. And I think that's why, because you are constantly pressing the reader to think about, is that you? Are you that person? Right?
Uh-huh. Um, yeah, I mean, I think what one of the things that you're saying there is that the book lets everybody have it, and no one is spared. And in that way, I was inspired by Bonfire of the Vanities. And one of the most rewarding, gratifying things about so far publishing this book is that a lot of early readers have come to the conclusion that it is a modern day Bonfire of the Vanities. And that's exactly what I was aiming at. And that book also took a look at various slices of New York life in the
Yeah.
1980s as a way of telling a story about who we are in America right now. And it has a lot of the same themes and elements about racism and class and adultery and crime and murder and crime and punishment about that crime. Um, I wanted to accomplish something similar in this book, but from a more contemporary sensibility. But the Bonfire of the Vanities sort of almost like a Dave Chappelle's show, insults absolutely everybody. And that there was something appealing about it. I mean, if you're insulting everybody, it's not personal and it's not about that individual insult. It's just taking a look at all of society and pointing out the foibles that we all have, that none of us is innocent. And a lot of people these days, I think, are walking around proclaiming themselves, signaling their virtue to everybody else. And I think a lot of those people too are not at all innocent. And if you scratch the surface a little bit, there's a good amount of hypocrisy in a lot of that, a good amount of self-promotion in all of this political activism. And that's something that I wanted to scratch the surface of and poke at, just as Tom Wolfe did 40 years ago.
Yeah.
By the way, Tom Wolfe published The Bonfire of the Vanities when he was 56 years old, and I am 56 years old.
That's a pretty cool parallel. And just like that book and the subsequent movie, there was this ramping up of tension that you just can't look away.
Yeah.
So very well done.
Thank you.
Now, I don't want to give away any spoilers, but I did want to ask you one last thing because this is really on my mind throughout the story. And that's this idea of, is there ever a justification for wrongdoing? Because we do this all the time, don't we, as people?
That's a great question. And I think one of my most formative novels when I was a very young man was Crime and Punishment, which is a long, dense, complicated, and very nuanced examination of that very question. Is crime always bad? And the flip side of that, I mean, that hinges on a murder, which is an exaggerated form of making that choice. But I think we all confront this type of thing on a daily basis. Is lying always wrong? I used to think that it was, and then I raised children, and then I marched my children through the streets of Copenhagen and Amsterdam when we were living in Luxembourg, and I was constantly telling my children, we are looking for a toy store. When we find a toy store, we will buy a box of Lego and we will sit down and we will have hot chocolate and you will build your Lego. Meanwhile, I knew exactly where the toy store was. I was not looking for a toy store. What I was doing something for my family that they didn't necessarily recognize they wanted, which was to walk around Bruges for an extra hour before we bought that Lego. And that was definitely a lie I was telling. But was it wrong? I really don't think it was wrong. And I think that's one end of a benign lie. But I think there are plenty of things that we do in our society, in our culture, that are patently untrue in a very, very negative way. And then there are things that we say or do that are maybe less than completely forthright, that are actually positive.
Yeah. Well, there's a moment in your story where at least one character that I'm thinking about had to take a look at her life and think, have I become what it is that I despise?
Yeah.
And, again, I think we all should be asking ourselves that question because that's where we are today, where we're casting a lot of stones and there's a lot of judgment and a lot of turmoil. But we have to wonder, am I that person?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And in truth, I want all of these characters to be asking that question. I think all of them do. And I don't know how you ended up feeling or how you've felt from the start about all of them, but I love all of them. I love their problems. I love their predicaments. I love the momentous decisions that they make at the end of this fateful and fatal day and how those decisions are intertwined with each other's lives. And I actually just like them. I mean, I wrote this story about people who are definitely flawed people, as we all are, who are confronting their flaws in this crime novel.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to tell our readers, I'm going to show this beautiful cover one more time, The Doorman by CHRIS Pavone. And we absolutely loved it. We've been talking about this book because you really do broach the themes of the day in such a probing way. I think that's a really good word that you had used earlier. I want to tell our listeners how to get in touch with you because you have a newsletter on your website. You're at chrispavone.com, Pavone, and you can sign up for the newsletter. We think this is going to be a big book. for good reason. It's the right book at the right time, but also entertaining, and you can't put it down. And that tension just ramps up. I love it. Um, you've been on the show twice, Chris. We hope that you come back. And I'm wondering if maybe you want to give us a little clue about what you might have on your radar next.
Oh my God, no. If I told you, I would be telling you before I told my publisher. I will say that the thing that I've been working on, which is not a book, is I've been in the process of trying to turn one of my novels into a feature film. And I'm doing some of it myself, not because I think it gives us the greatest chance of success, which it definitely does not, but because I want to do something new. And a lot of what's going on in this book also is that at a certain point in life, you stop doing new things. And it is an immense hole that I think people fill in ways that are sometimes destructive and wasteful and hurtful. But then there are other ways to fill that hole. And I'm pursuing one of those by trying to make a movie, which has been a fascinating and really, really fun experience.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. Well, we've seen your career: writer, editor, author, maybe producer, screenwriter. But for all of it, we're thrilled for you. And we know this book is going to do great. So please come back on the show in the future. But we are excited for you. And we're telling everybody to make sure that they pick up this book. And anytime you want to come back, Chris, you let us know. But thank you so much for coming on the show to talk about this one.
Thank you so much. It was great to talk to you.
You as well. Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right, listeners, you heard from CHRIS PAVONE. He has got this fantastic book, The Doorman, coming out. This one will cause ripples across society. It is fascinating. It's an exploration of our common humanity, but also the things that divide us, but always going back to love and empathy. So I really encourage you. I think you're going to love it. I want to tell you about some other authors that are coming up. We have an incredible lineup for the summer and the fall. Jesse Rosen with All the Signs, Chanel Cleaton, The Lost Story of Eva Fuentes, Elma Katsu with Fiend, Amy Austin, His Last Mistress, Christina Baker Klein and Ann Burt with Please Don't Lie, Susan Wiggs, Wayward Girls, Adam Plantinga, Hardtown, Christina McMorris, The Girls of Good Fortune, Clemence Michelin, Our Last Resort, Adriana Trigiani, The View from Lake Como, Isabella Maldonado and Jeffrey Deaver coming back to talk about The Grave Artist. We have several more. I can't even go through the entire list, but just tune in. You can find us on our website at bookstormpodcast.com. You can find us on YouTube. Just search for Bookstorm and podcast. We should come right up. And of course, we are on social media. We love to hear from you. We're very excited that you're tuning in, and we ask that you share those socials. And we know why you're tuning in, because your favorite authors are here on the show, Bookstorm Podcast.